Hey, in different courses, I have discussed various aspects of climate justice, climate impact, disparities, and so on. I'm adding a podcast here under new findings, basically from a paper that just appeared in Nature Sustainability, which looks at details of consumption, carbon footprints across the world, including poor countries, and tries to estimate what the carbon emission increase would be if there is poverty alleviation in terms of lifting people from various levels of poverties as defined by the World Bank, and see how much increase would happen and what that would imply for rich countries who are emitting most of the carbon anyways. Okay, so here let me start with this World Bank report as well. Percentage reporting economic impacts from weather shocks in the last 5 years by wealth quintile. 5 country sample in MENA, Middle East, North America. That's from 2011, so a bit old, but the idea hasn't changed much in terms of the impacts. Okay, so lost income, poorest have the highest percentage economic impact compared to, let's say, the richest. Lost crops, again, the rich farmers do not suffer as much as the poorest ones, and there is a gradation along the way for second, third, and fourth quintiles as well. Lost livestock or cattle, again, marginally higher for the poorest. And less fish caught also works for subsistence fisheries versus industrial fisheries with all their boats and gear and labor and so on and so forth. Not surprising, right? So impact of climate change on poverty at the $2 line, assuming no changes in poverty elasticity of growth. So there are assumptions to be assumptions are made about how economic growth affects poverty and its elasticity. So you can think of it as purchasing power and so on. There are many ways econometrics work. So in the baseline scenario 2005 to 2055, number of poor in millions should drop with a change of 810.3 millions. Headcount poverty rate would also drop if we have climate change benefiting some of the poorest. So business as usual, which is different from baseline. There are details here where baseline is taking some year like 2010, assuming an economic growth, whereas business as usual goes more into the kind of choices we make for energy, renewables, transportations, policies for climate change action, and so on and so forth. So here again, the number of millions is the same, but you can see the number of poor doesn't drop as much. So there is a difference of this is different from baseline. This is business as usual, so I don't want to go into too many details, but there are options for optimal abatement of poverty or climate change impact on people, and that would give you certain numbers as well. So is it good news that climate change impacts will be alleviated in the future? Well, it depends also on many scenarios and the assumptions that are made in the scenarios, but what we can do is come back and look at emissions of the richest 10%. So here's the richest 10% and the rest of the world. They are basically about the same share of total carbon emissions over 1990 to 2015, which is shown here as well. And the richest 1% are responsible for double the carbon emissions of the poorest 50%. So that's a kind of a drastic comparison there by Oxfam. And the richest 1% are responsible for double the carbon emissions of the poorest 50%, and that is not changing so much over the years. So you have to reconcile these kind of projections with these in the historical period, right? So keeping this in mind and noting that the Sustainable Development Goals, the number one is about poverty. So every country is committing to net zero, climate action, Paris Agreement, nationally determined contributions, and so on. But in actuality, what is the impact of poverty alleviation measures on carbon emissions? That's what this new paper looks at in Nature Sustainability, starting again with what we have already seen many times, national and regional average carbon footprints. So you can see the colors here, and obviously you can see the carbon footprint in tons per CO2. African countries and some of these Central Asian countries, Nepal, Bangladesh, Bhutan, and so on, have remarkably low carbon footprints in tons per person per year. India and China are growing, and we will see in a minute that even within a country, when you divide into the consumption levels, obviously there are huge differences in the richest and the poorest in a country like India or China. And there are other countries, obviously United States has a fairly significant carbon footprint, and so does Russia somewhere in the middle, and European Union has a distribution as well. So looking at region average expenditure in thousand US dollars pegged to 2014 in terms of purchasing power parity, which basically takes some exchange rate and a basket of goods to see how much a same income would buy in different countries. It's kind of an economic way of comparing different countries with different currencies that have different values when pegged against something like the dollar. Okay, and it's again what you would expect. So you have sub-Saharan Africa with regional expenditure being incredibly low in thousands of US dollars purchasing power parity. So just look at the relative numbers if you don't understand the details of how purchasing power parity works. Okay, so India is here doing better than South and Southeast Asia on average, and Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and MENAT are doing better here. There's a way to separate Middle East and the North Africa by taking out the rich countries, I suspect. China is doing well. Russia and Central Asia. Europe, of course, is slightly above Russia and Central Asia, and US is way up here in terms of its regional expenditure. If you do it in per capita carbon footprints for each decile of regional populations, looking at the circle values of 50 million and 100 million, so obviously this will be something like I suspect 20 million or so, so just try to get a sense. And then you look at decile average expenditure again in thousands of US dollars pegged to 2014 in terms of purchasing power parity. So carbon footprint here obviously depends on consumption. You can see that some percentage of the population in the United States is emitting what we saw before as 50 tons of CO2, whereas the average for the US is somewhere around 16 ton per person, I think, and China is around 7, India is around 3. But you can see the difference. There are many wretchedly poor people of the order of 100 million almost or more living in basically even negative carbon footprint by these calculations, and there are richer ones which get into kind of the emission levels that are fairly high compared to, let's say, the poorer ones in the United States. So surprisingly, even in the United States, when you look at decile expenditure, there are plenty of poor people, and of course there are lots of rich people. So the distribution is less unequal in Europe in many ways, but you can see in China it's quite unequal as well. So this matters because when you do poverty alleviation, you have to remember that you will increase the expenditure and carbon footprint of the poorest ones and then the paper wants to see how much that would result in terms of increased carbon footprint. Turns out overall carbon emission, it turns out that it is under 2%, so it's not very significant, but it depends on regional distribution as well. For example, sub-Saharan Africa, if you bring them to some level of above poverty line, then that would double the emissions, so you have to make adjustments in the rich countries to keep the overall goals towards global warming targets that we have been talking about in terms of 2 degrees C warming, and with 66% probability at 2100 or 1.5, and the corresponding emission pathways we need to stay on to reach those targets. Okay, so here is the global population, again looking at population distribution in terms of carbon emissions and carbon footprint. So top 1%, next 9% here, 40% and 50%, and here again you have this is the total global carbon emissions, so CBE. Okay, so you can see that the 1% here is emitting 15%, next 9% is emitting 32%, next 40% is emitting 43%, and this bottom 50% still remains at 10%. So these are serious disparities, and if you look at carbon footprint in this way again, where you have bottom 50% in terms of tons of CO2, similar to what we already saw. So the top 1% is emitting enormous amount of carbon for their lifestyle. So finally, how does it work in terms of looking for carbon emission increases, percentage increases, global relative increase in carbon emission and expenditure for each poverty alleviation scenario? So I'm not going to get into the details of this. There are papers and World Bank categorizations of poverties. So extreme poverty, national poverty 1, national poverty 2, extreme plus national poverty 1, extreme plus national poverty 2, and this is poverty measured in terms of daily income of $3.20, so $3.20 pegged to some year, and SC7, which is a little bit better, so $5.50. So you can see in each case increasing or alleviating extreme poverty here. So you can look at the regions here: China, Europe in this orangish color, India is in this reddish color, Latin America, MENAT, Russia, Central Asia, Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and United States. Obviously, depending on the population and where you are going from in terms of baseline, so going from $5.50 income per day to above poverty line, you can see how the carbon footprint jumps. Okay, so percentage wise you can see global mean would not be very serious, but regional distributions are serious, and you can, for example, double the CO2 even in sub-Saharan Africa and for India and China and so on, when you take the percentage of population that is in that country living at those levels. So I hope you get the message that alleviating poverty and meeting the Sustainable Development Goal 1 is not going to affect carbon emissions very seriously when you look at the global mean emission increase, but obviously it will increase enough that there has to be adjustment by the richest countries to bring down their emissions to keep the total emissions on path to meeting global warming targets. There is no choice that we have to move these people out of poverty and above some well-defined poverty line. But as we discussed in the book How Bad Are Bananas, you can I don't think we know exactly how this will work out, but let's say we somehow decided to give everybody a 10 ton CO2 per year per person footprint, and you will have to then move these poor people way up in terms of their consumption and increase carbon footprint along with that, but then you have to correspondingly bring down the carbon footprint of the richest people. Will this happen? Well, let's hope so. But it's clear now that the continued disparities of consumption, contribution to global warming and emissions, and disparate impacts on the poor cannot continue forever. So let's leave it there, okay?